Bangladesh's former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has been found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. A special tribunal found her responsible for ordering a violent crackdown on student-led protests last year, during which the UN estimated that up to 1,400 people died, and most of them by gunfire from security forces. Sheikh Hasina, who has been living in exile in India, was tried in her absence. She has described the court's verdict as biased and politically motivated. With some protests already breaking out this morning, security has been ramped up across Bangladesh over fear of a backlash. Sheikh Hasina holds the record of being Bangladesh's longest serving prime minister so far. Now, for more on this court verdict, global affairs analyst Collins Oweke joins me now from Belgium. Good to have you join us.
Thank you, Precious. Thank you for having me.
So for families who lost loved ones in this during that protest, they have called this justice. But for Sheikh Hasina, she said this is politically motivated. And I just want to ask you what side you lean to. Is this verdict justice or is it political persecution?
That's a tough one. What we are witnessing in Bangladesh today is extraordinary by any global standard. I don't quite think, for onlookers like myself, that it's a question of leaning to any side. Because a former prime minister who ruled the country for, nearly 15 years, have just been sentenced to death in absentia for crimes against humanity related to, brutal crackdown on student protesters. And that was just, a year ago. So we can say that there is, evidence of, speedy trial here. The tribunal's ruling comes after one of the bloodiest, civil unrest in the history of Bangladesh, recent history, with well over 1,000 casualties. As a matter of fact, the casualties have been put on 1,400, and while supporters call this verdict a long overdue step towards accountability, and I'm now coming to the core of your question, critics insist that the process is actually politically motivated, and, all of these raises serious questions about, due process and then also impartiality. So I think it's difficult to lean to a particular side, but, while the trial's timing, that's the fact that, it happened in absentia and the concerns about legal transparency, all this makes, people argue that this is politically driven. Bangladesh has a long history of deep political polarization. So almost every major decision is interpreted through, some sort of a partisan lens. The truth, however, and this is really where I personally come in, is somewhere in between. Clear evidence of abuses exists, but the legal process must meet international standards if the outcome is to be considered, credible and indeed stabilizing.
And then we also understand that protests had broken out this morning, even though authorities are taking steps to ensure that there is no backlash from that sentence. But just what does this mean for Bangladesh's stability? We saw that protest and how it rocked the country before she fled.
Indeed, absolutely. Bangladesh is entering a very, very delicate moment. Now, on the one hand, some citizens may feel a sense of closure, that at long last, this has happened, they can now put it, behind them. But on the other hand, Hasina still commands very large followership through the Awami League, the political party, through whose platform, she came to power and ruled for, nearly 15 years. So the verdict could inflame, tensions in Bangladesh. And indeed, signs of it is actually the, protests that we have seen. The security services are already on alert because the risk of renewed, heightened protests, something more serious than what we have seen yesterday, even up till about an hour or two ago, they are there. Retaliatory violence is also real. And when a major political figure is sentenced to death, especially in absentia, it really ends the story. As a matter of fact, if anything, it often escalates, the story. So the next few weeks, just like we've seen the sign yesterday, will be critical for, maintaining order, managing emotions, and, preventing political competition from sliding into more chaos.
And you mentioned the Awami League Party, which is, the former ruling party, and her party. She still heads that party even while in exile. I'm wondering what this means for them. Authorities there have been, clamping down on their messaging. Most of their leaders are in exile, and their foremost leader has now been sentenced to death. What does this mean for that party, and then also for her in a future in politics, if any?
Well, our future in politics, as a matter of fact, is precarious. I mean, and that is actually putting it rather mildly. And, that is also part of, what people have actually been hammering on, that the timing is suspicious. Suspicious in the sense that there is election planned for next year. So, at the end of the day, the sentencing is not only a legal development, it is a national and geopolitical moment. It forces Bangladesh to confront its past, but also demands a reflection about its future, about justice, about fairness and political pluralization, and how societies navigate moments of deep trauma. I mean, we experienced a similar thing in Nigeria, a few years back with the toll gate, protests and massacre. So for the rest of the world, including Nigeria, this is yet another reminder that governance must be proactive, not reactive, that youth grievances must never be dismissed, as nothing, and that justice must be done both. It must be seen to be done and indeed be done as a matter of fact. So the Hasina verdict may have, closed one chapter, but ultimately, I think, many other chapters have just been opened in Bangladesh.
And just more broadly, let's look at what this means. She's in exile. She's in India. India had earlier rejected claims to or calls to extradite her back to Bangladesh for a lesser sentencing. But now that this is a sentence to death, what pressure is on India now for her extradition?
Sheikh Hasina has been in India since she was ousted from government. Bangladesh requesting extradition, which they haven't seriously done so far, will put India in a very, very uncomfortable position. Let's not forget that India must now balance, its strategic interests, because this is what this is all about as well. It has to do with the strategic interests of the countries, concerned, quite apart from the moral arguments around it. They also have to consider human rights obligations because they are signatories to a number of international treaties that they have the obligation to honor. And then domestic political pressure, because don't forget, Hasina has her, followers or supporters in India, while she also has critics. So India is now faced with having to balance, all of these dynamics. Also, the Western countries and the United Nations will, scrutinize the fairness of the trial. If the process in their books is seen as politically tainted, Bangladesh could face, diplomatic friction and pressure on aid, on trade, and, military cooperation. So regionally, the verdict could stabilize South Asia's political dynamics, especially if unrest, actually escalates.
And you already touched on, what I was going to ask you about the region as well. I don't know how much. I mean, it's a region where we've seen a lot of conflicts. We've seen India, Pakistan conflict. I mean, there's some semblance of conflict in that region and tension. Can that region handle any more tension if this were to escalate in Bangladesh?
Well, it's difficult, and that is why at this moment the same thing to do is actually the reason that diplomacy was created, which is talk, negotiate, and find middle ground. So rather than waiting until tensions escalate, I mean, countries in that region have got to see a need for them to step in now in whichever way possible. So the first lesson is the cost of ignoring youth grievances. Now, those who are going to intervene, I mean, regional powers, have got to, put that on the table. And then secondly, strong institutions matter. Now, I think it's important for Bangladesh to realize that, and, that has to be factored in by the regional their neighbors that are actually intervening in this. So there are things you just can't overlook. And if they take all of those into consideration, I believe that they will then be dealing with the issue proactively rather than waiting for tensions to escalate with more protests and all of that, and then it becomes unmanageable.
So I wanted us to sort of expand this conversation. We've looked at it in context of Bangladesh, India, and that region, but just looking at it this time, coming back to Africa, just this morning I read a report of how Nigeria has rejected calls by Cameroonian authorities for the extradition of opposition candidate Bakary Shiroma back to Cameroon. Very different circumstance, quite all right. But is there something to learn here in terms of how the rules and regulation of the international laws guiding extradition?
Absolutely. The first lesson, in my view, is the cost of ignoring youth grievances. The Bangladeshi protest began with just a simple economic frustration. Young people who do not, feel there is any perspective for them in the country. Some of them who could are living in droves. The Jackpot syndrome, to use a Nigerian, parlance. A civil service quota was also part of, what they were demanding. But all of this snowballed into a national crisis because government failed to respond early. Now, the second lesson to learn here is that strong institutions matter. When political rivalry replaces institutional credibility, I mean, even legitimate justice actions look like political vendetta. And so for Africa, I would say that they must remember that governance failure everywhere is a mirror anywhere. Leaders must build responsive systems, establish credible accountability processes, and maintain open channels of dialogue, particularly with the youth. Oftentimes, early warning systems, are ignored, and this actually leads to national instability. Now, Nigeria has done something uncommon. I mean, based on the report that you read. Ordinarily, the generic response is for Nigeria to stand firmly with the government of the other country, but Nigeria not immediately jumping in defense of that country actually, tells you that the story of how countries support any other country, no matter the rogue activities, that chapter in our history, particularly in Africa, is beginning to close, and I hope they keep this up.
And let's talk about some of the things we've seen in Africa this year, especially when it has to do with the conduct of elections. You know what's happening in Cameroon. We mentioned that earlier. We know what happened what's happening now in Tanzania. And just recently, we understand that President Omar Gwele of Djibouti has now decided to run for his sixth term. When you look at, and I'm speaking to this in terms of how, the uprising we've seen in some countries around the world, that if we continue to do things like this, are we likely to have a Bangladeshi situation on our hands in several African countries?
We are heading for a worse situation than the Bangladeshi situation if the book is not rewritten at this point. I mean, we're dealing with a situation that is, getting more and more precarious. Gone are the days when you can dictate for young people based on, political interest of leaders. The world has actually evolved into a global village that kids, young people are learning every day. And they are also linking up with, other young people in other parts of the world where they get all sorts of support that they need and actually require. And so in that context of, the global village that the world has become, I think leaders have got, to realize that time is not on their side anymore. Young people are losing patience and are getting more and more, assertive in terms of what they want, and they are getting global support. So, the situation is no longer tenable where, constitutions of countries are rewritten to, get somebody to stay in office for as long as he chooses. Now, don't get me wrong. There is absolutely nothing wrong in changing a constitution. But if you do so while in power, you shouldn't be a beneficiary of such a term elongation. These are basic tenets of, democracy that Africa has no choice now but to embrace.
And just finally, before I let you go, I wanted to ask you back to Bangladesh now, if this verdict can be realistically enforced, given Hasina is in exile, and then also tie this to the sentencing of the former president of Cameroon, Joseph Kabila, who was also tried in absentia.
Well, enforcement is highly, highly unlikely for now. A death sentence in absentia is more symbolic, than practical. Bangladesh must convince India, for a start, to extradite, Sani. Delhi is under no legal obligation to do so. Now, what this verdict really does is that it reshapes the political landscape going into the next election. It limits Hasina's ability to return or participate politically, and it gives the interim government a sense of momentum. So ruling her out is already a big victory for the interim government. But enforceability, that will depend almost entirely on India, regional politics, and whether Bangladesh recalibrates, the sentence under international pressure. Because don't forget, Precious, that, the international community is watching. The UN is taking note and, trying to see the extent to which, this trial could be considered free and fair, and that, it is not based on political motivation. So all of these are dynamics and pressures to be watched before one can talk of enforceability. But it is highly, highly unlikely.
And I was asking that you tie it to the DR Congo situation with Joseph Kabila.
Yeah, the situation is not going to be different with Joseph Kabila. He's on exile, and it looks unlikely. Now, it also has to do with, the agreement between the two nations involved, Democratic Republic of Congo and, the country where he's on exile, whether, they have, such agreement. Beside that, of course, strategic interest is of importance. Of what value is it to, the country hosting him on exile, and, what leverage does Kabila give him? So again, any situation of, trial and conviction in absentia is always very, very difficult to enforce, particularly in developing democracies, like in Africa.
Thank you so much for your brilliant analysis, as always, Collins Oweke, Global Affairs Analyst.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.